I am very pleased to have you here with us at Active Learning at Lunch. For those of you who may not be regulars at Active Learning at Lunch, I don't know if we have any regulars, actually. Fine. But this is a monthly forum. We have lunch, but mostly what we do is we ask a colleague to come and talk about some teaching and learning related topics, something that they're doing in their teaching, so that we can hear about what they're doing and then have a discussion about it. So I'm very pleased that this month's feature presenter is Patrick Lowenthal from the Department of Ed Tech, and he's going to be talking about how he uses discussion threads.
All right. So I need to first say that I'm trying to record this. Now, I say trying because this was my plan. Keep in mind I'm in Ed Tech, so I have 18 devices. This was the computer that was going to be used. It now is rebooting every second and will not actually mount and start up literally seconds before I came. My thought was I'll reboot it, fresh start, it'll be good to record. It's worthless.
It's not just PCs that do that.
No, and that's the classic thing that kills me, because that's my classic PC joke, right? The guy comes in, has problems, and I'm like, get a Mac. I got like 4, but I guess the big story is always have a backup plan. So I always post my slides to my website. I post them on SlideShare. So I'm always ready to go. So I'm still going to try to record on the second computer I brought. And I'll tell you why in a little while. We're going to play with devices if you have one. But with that, I am recording because not just being in Ed Tech, when we do these things, so many people can't come. And so the hope is, while it's not the same experience, that we can at least archive the experience. And so with that, keep that in mind. Okay, so the other thing I guess I should say is this is the first time I've been to one of these, let alone led one. So I don't really know how this works. My last institution, we used to do this a lot. So I feel like I do have prior knowledge. I've done a lot of faculty development workshops, and I always find that food brings the people out. But with that, I still don't know this environment. So while I have a plan of what's going to happen, this isn't really about me. This is about you guys. And this isn't really about me sharing that I have the holy grail of what to do with discussions, but rather to give us a time to talk about, well, how do we use discussions? How do you use them? What's some of the best practices that we know? And so while I have a plan, I'm recording, I'm doing all of this, I'm happy to shut everything down and just talk about whatever makes sense for the group. Okay? Also with that, jump in at any time, because this can go any which way. But this is kind of my general thinking. So background, I'm going to kind of talk about why I'm here, why online discussions, why it interests me. And then I'm going to get into, we're going to brainstorm, because in my experience, the collective wisdom of the people who've done this and struggled with this is often where a lot of the answers and best practices, if you will, lie. I'm going to talk about some research that I've done, looking at the literature on online discussions. I'm going to share some tips, some little things that I do. They might make sense, they might not. And then we're going to wrap up and we're going to discuss. I have a handout that has some down and dirty guidelines for online discussions. So depending on where we are with time, we'll get into some of that. And like I said, I'm not stuck to kind of any agenda per se. This is my general framework. Okay. I want you to think about this sentence. Online discussions are blank. So for teachers, right, how do you think teachers would finish this sentence? Online discussions are assessments. Educational. Interactive. Okay, great. I'm like, someone's got to have a negative one here. Labor intensive. Okay. Community building. Okay. And one of the things too, while I've done this kind of presentation before, I really should have teachers who have taught online versus who haven't. I should have almost full professors who aren't. I'm a junior faculty. So in my experience, depending on our background, we answer these questions differently. We think about these things differently. As a whole, there are exceptions to everything, right? So students, think of the 18 to 20, our traditional students, if you will, if there is such a thing as traditional students. How would they finish this? Online discussions are busy work. Painful. What was that? Pointless. Okay. So what about non-traditional students? Do you think they would answer this any different? Convenient. Allows a voice. Great.
Not convenient.
Okay. No painful, nothing. All right. Some of them might say it depends, right? If it's relevant to their practice, if they think this is going to help them get that job, do that next thing, then it's great. But they're also, in my experience, sometimes a lot more skeptical of things that they think are busy work, right? And so you see some themes throughout this. In some ways, we all have the same experience, right? Online discussions aren't necessarily good or bad. It just depends. They can be for assessments. They can be busy work. They can be community building, but they can be none of this, right? In my experience, typically, if it bores me, it's boring my students, right? And I guess something I should say, too, about that. I've been teaching online since 2003. I teach in that tech program. We are only an online program, graduate program. I've been an online student. So I taught my first online course on dial-up. I took my first online course on dial-up. So I've been doing this a while. Once again, I don't necessarily have the answers. That's why I'm here, for us to talk. But my experience, typically, this is what online discussions look like. 1 to 2 discussions every week. They tend to be large, entire class discussions. They tend to be, most discussions are based on the textbooks. And then they tend to be something like post 1 original post and reply to 2 to 3 of your peers within the week. Right? This is kind of our framework. And it's not necessarily that this can inherently be bad. This can be very successful. It kind of, the something of this should always be, well, it depends. But after I've done this over and over again, I've struggled with it. I've been wondering, why do we have online discussions? In some ways, in the last over 10 years, 15 years, however it's been, I've come full circle. So my first online course that I took as a student was a course in JavaScript and PHP programming. It's programming. And I'm not even really a programmer, but I get the idea. You get in there and you do stuff, and you post it. Well, they wanted me to discuss. I'm like, discuss? I was 3 weeks in and I realized they were discussions that I wasn't taking part in. And then I'm like, wait a minute. So then I had to do all this extra credit to even get an A in the course. I thought it was ridiculous. So that's my student experience. But during this time, I was working at Regis University out of Colorado, and we do a lot of online learning there. And I began in charge of their online learning program, and I thought I knew it all, right? I mean, I knew this is, if I go back there, right, this is what I knew. Every discussion has this. It's for community building. It's for assessment. It's for all these things. So I had to take a doctoral course on qualitative research at a nearby institution. Online course. I get in there. I get in the discussion forum, and I just start going away. And well, it ends up, it really wasn't a discussion-based course at all. It was essentially an independent study with Blackboard, right? It was 100 people, and so once again, I was challenged with this idea of, well, I thought discussions were this. This is what I thought online learning was, but it's not always. So now, even if I get into my own course, I'm teaching a course right now in web development where students have to develop instructional websites. And it's not a discussion-heavy course. And my students constantly push up against me because it doesn't look like this, right? They want to know why I'm not doing this, because this is what their schema tells them. This is what they should be doing. All right, so I keep struggling. Why do we have discussions? Why are they asynchronous? Why are they every week? Why do we grade them, right? So what does the literature say? I started wondering about that. And most importantly, what do you guys say? All right, that's where we are now. This is where I stop talking. We start to brainstorm. All right, so we're going to take 15 minutes. And it can actually see, I didn't know how this would break up, but the tables work fine. Basically, you just need a peer or two. And I'm going to, if you guys can pass these out. If you have a device, fire up the device too. Let's take a couple of these. Basically, what I want to do is the directions are on. You'll just pass these around. I want you to talk with your peers, and essentially this is what you're doing. You're getting in small groups. You're going to talk about your experience using threaded discussions. What works well, what doesn't work well. And then from your group, I want you to identify 1 to 2 things to share with the rest of us. Right? And so if you have a device and you're feeling brave, go to the Google Doc and you can edit there. I have a couple devices here too if you want to use one. If the idea of using a device is crazy to you, and that's totally fine, that's why we have paper. Write down, after you guys share, we're going to take about 5 to 10 minutes for you guys to talk. And then we're going to come back and we're going to share what are your best practices. I mean, what have you learned or what have you heard if you've never done this before? Right? So that's the idea here. Any questions? All right. So don't be quiet, talk to your peers. or eat. Yeah, say hi to each other.
Okay. She's ready. You want me to write? Sure. You talk, I'll write.
Whenever I try to synchronously interact with our students, they're always they're on the second question, and I'm still trying to interact with my first person. So I don't students' discussion. I do an announcement at the end of the week summarizing the threads and students in the discussion. Frustrated practice with us. They're just moving on. If I try to respond to one person, it's moving to each other. Discussion board, so just on the second question.
So I just put timing. Timing's not the same between the teacher and student and the discussions.
So at least the what do they say what they like? Essentially what they were saying because the prompt, if you want to get into this, there's so much that
You're trying to type in. Yep, it's already there. You just start typing and do its thing. Sure.
How do I say the same thing as right now, but in a different way so it doesn't look like a paper. And it's not sitting there. It's not physically the discussion open-ended, debatable enough that it fosters real growth. All of us discussion writer two or three students probably is enough to sufficient. I'm sorry, I'm an older person. One of their friends, the other very friend, and the trigger that invites different opinions, different positions, take a position and justify it and stuff. So this is one of those issues where like, well, there's one right answer in anybody suggestion about that. Right? The latter discussion will be more of an essay. Still needs to be the difference between a good essay class and
that's the expectation. Well, I'm speaking in a highly typed format.
If you're going to have a discriminatory word for discussion,
we find the big difference also between shallow and radical.
the draft is much more engaged. It seems to me in the discussion. I mean, we may cite a couple of references. Also, so they're actually reading, reading. The undergrads tend to get a lot of I agree. No, I tend to hit them. Don't disagree. Or if you want to say that much more detail is basically
Find differences in size or
I like that.
levels.
you have a variety of different people that
Yeah.
use the rate. Kind of like on an SAT.
I guess our latest iteration.
We're going to take a couple more minutes and then come back together.
Would that be wise in a hybrid?
Or they don't. This held up in this study was that getting in really early. So she's not interested, but in the course, is my level. And by doing that, that helps me understand, and it's early, and then I don't have to keep putting that in. And the river
All right, one more minute, guys, and let's come back together. All right, so let's take a look at what you guys came up with. So I will make sure Susan gets this list and sends it out to you. I do this type of stuff all the time, and I've done it where I compare. So I have this from the Northwest eLearn. I presented this. I have their same document of data to kind of compare. And I actually did a different kind of take on this where I asked people what's the top 2 things they learned about Teach Online. So not just about online discussions. And I have 6 conferences worth of data from people where you can mine this stuff. So think about ways that you can use Google Docs with your students to get them interactive, to create interactive note-taking. Does it have to be Google Docs? No. There's lots of things out there. And what I will say, too, is always be aware and test it. There are limits, right? Google Docs, I think, has 50 people editing at one time. So then, if you have larger classes, think about that. But all right, so let's go through this. And I'm going to talk through these points, and if it's something that your table came up with, jump in and add, clarify. But we're going to kind of go through what you guys came up with. Then we're going to jump into some themes that came out of a literature review I did. And then we're going to kind of bring it back to some tips that I have that might be up here, might not. And then we will see how we are with some final discussion when I pass out a couple of handouts. Okay, so the first tip, give choice for students, right? So choice in prompts. So the idea is that there's probably 2 things here, right? There's choice where it could be in a given week, pick one of the 2 threads and respond to the prompt, or it could be choice even at a larger scale that says you have to respond to 10 prompts throughout the semester, you pick which 10. So there are a couple ways you could do that, right? But the idea is we all like choice, right? We all like to decide what engages us, what we want to jump into. Number 2, prompts that need to elicit multiple perspectives, right? So not a yes/no kind of, did you like the chapter? Yes, right? You want something that's gonna get people excited, and you have to keep in mind. So sometimes, I always think of like abortion or something that can really fire discussions up, right? Everyone's got an opinion, even they who don't have one. I'm not saying talk about abortion. Trust me, it's not related to the course. Don't talk about it. But my point rather is sometimes there's very provocative comments that do bring in multiple perspectives. But sometimes you can even ask them, take the perspective of a high school teacher. How would they respond to X, right? And try to get them in that role. All right, so then establish a rhythm of exercise. The main response by Thursday, respond to others by Saturday. One of the things people often complain about are that their discussion students are just last minute posting on Sunday. Well, usually that's because that's the way it's been set up. Whereas if you tell them to get points, they have to post by Wednesday. They'll post by Wednesday, and then if you tell them they have to respond by Sunday, you'll see the second bit of responses on Sunday, right? I mean, this is kind of human nature, but it's helping them understand the rhythm, right? So if you're doing this regularly, don't change it up where it's totally unclear to them. Be very explicit, right? Have a rhythm to it. They know what's expected, and they can manage their time. Offer prompts that allow them to talk about their lived experiences, right? And then help them tie those into informed opinions, right? Not just, well, I found X, but it is important, right? Where people want to talk about. That's why every time I've done faculty groups, half the time when faculty get together, they just want to talk. They don't want to listen to me. And so I try to provide those options for you guys, and students are no different. We like to start with our lived experience, and the more we can bring that into it, right? It helps build meaning, it helps build connections, right? So then 5, provide a grading rubric, right, that they can see ahead of time. So there's no surprises. Where are we? 6, consider prompts that people feel invested in. This kind of goes back to the lived experience, but it's this thing that when you just ask them sometimes about the reading, what do you think of the reading, or what was the most useful insight? That type of thing makes me, when I read it, it makes me just want to find the first thing and say, blah, 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 and then I'm done, right? I'm not invested at all. Whereas all of a sudden, what's one thing you disagreed with in the chapter, right? Or there's ways that you can kind of get at that same thing, but get them involved in it, right? Having a sense of community relationships can help people invest in discussion. So a lot of my research kind of gets on this, but this idea of when we know each other, we're more likely to discuss more. And there's some other arguments about having smaller groups that stay together or cohort classes, which I could talk about more, but it's this idea of we're definitely a lot more comfortable talking to people we know. When I go to a party and there's a person or two I know, that's who I flock to. When I go to people I know and I have a relationship with. It doesn't even always have to be people you like. It's just people you're comfortable with, right? And they're comfortable with you. So build off the discussion thread in the next class meeting so students learn that it matters. So this idea of integrating, where it's not just this 1 week, you keep kind of tying things back together and you integrate it throughout. And that might play too. There was a discussion over here about hybrid versus not. And so a lot of these ideas relate, whether it's a hybrid or fully online, or maybe it's some professional development you're doing online, right? But you have to help them see that this discussion is not busy work. Coach the student, give them guidelines, right? On how to, so there's 2 parts here on this. It's give them guidelines, but then specifically how to extend conversation. Because we get in this idea at times that students who are born with computers in their life are somehow experts at computer-mediated communication, right? Because they're on Facebook, they're all of a sudden experts at using these as learning devices. In my experience, that's not necessarily true. And they definitely don't know how to necessarily deepen a conversation, right? And especially when it's set up as, I just need to reply to you, I just have to check the boxes and get done and get in and out. That doesn't help me kind of learn how to ask a question sometimes rather than a reply. And they do need this experience. They do need to learn this. So what is the instructor's role in keeping conversation going? All right, what is the analogy of the in-class synchronous discussion? And what are the pros and cons of intervention? Wow, we could just have a session on that, right? I mean, that alone. And in some ways, I'd say there's not necessarily one right answer all the time. Some of it goes to teacher style in my experience. Some people like to be heavily involved. Some people don't. But I think one of the things that's talked about here is we talk about online learning as you become more of a facilitator of meaning making of knowledge, right? So the idea is that you're not necessarily, forgive the old cliche, the sage on the stage, that you're asking more questions necessarily than telling it. You know when to back off. Because the experience of face-to-face is you start talking, everyone shuts up and listens, right? You're the teacher. Well, the same thing can happen online. So a colleague of mine, I'm going to hand out some of her work later, she would do things where she would tell students, discussions would start on Monday. She wouldn't start discussing until Thursday or Friday. She made it clear because she did not, because once she got in the discussion, even when she tried to step back and be soft hands and kind of facilitate it, so often it came about the instructor, right? And this is natural. You're grading them. You're in a position of power. But it is that there's this. Do you want to say more, Susan? I suspect this is you, right?
Well, we were just talking about it.
Yeah.
If a discussion is stalled, can the instructor do something to intervene, right? But then we realize, well, that isn't necessarily a best practice because it's the instant.
Yeah. Well, and to me, what I've done many times, and people have also described my styles, you just ask questions. You don't say anything, right? And so sometimes what I'll do is reach out and ask someone else in the class who I know their experience, or I know they know this, or they said something earlier. I might go, Leaf, what do you think about this, right? And so I'm kind of giving them a nudge to get in there. So sometimes just like in a face-to-face where you might call someone out, you can do that type of stuff online. It doesn't always have to be you answering. But go for it.
So what do you do if a student says something that might just be blatantly wrong or inaccurate, and then other students start latching on to that, and step in and correct and say, well, really it's this, or do you do kind of the Socratic flow?
It depends on what it is and how wrong it is, right? I mean, most things in life, in my experience, my background's in philosophy of religion, so most things, there's never a pure right and wrong, right? But, like, if I'm doing HTML code, right, there is, no, that's wrong. That is not valid code. I would jump in and I would tell them. But more often, if it's not, what I try to do is I ask others what they think. Do you agree? Do you not? And someone is going to jump in, usually, and say, well, what about? But have I corrected students' incorrect thinking? Definitely. But in my experience, there's other disciplines probably have more black and white than mine. It's a lot of it, well, it depends. But it is this thing. It goes back to kind of like guidance about lived experience. Just because you think so doesn't mean you're right, or doesn't make your point as valid as all the others, right? And so sometimes I might refer to an article or something. Have you seen this? What do you think when you see that? Right? And so, but this sometimes is hard in the discussion where, especially if it's going to end on a Sunday, right? And this is Saturday night at midnight, and people are done, right? So sometimes I'll then tie that back into an announcement. Hey, an interesting thing came up this week, guys. And I use a lot of video, and I talk through it. Right, but
I try to keep the comfort level there. So if it's Saturday night, that wouldn't work what I was going to say. Rather than me stepping in, I write to the student and think about what you said and how other people might take that, and try to build. What would you think about going in and saying, maybe I think that a little too something? I don't want to be the referee or anything.
Definitely, and I've done that when language comes up, right? So when you use something like oh hell, where they use a word that it's not blatantly, but it still is offensive for certain people, right? And so I've definitely, at times I've just edited the response and told the student, hey, this isn't really cool, this is why, don't do it. But there are other times where it's, hey, you said this, no one complained, but keep in mind, you can really rub people the wrong way. And so I definitely, in that sense, but yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Respond back to the group.
Yeah, see, that's great.
I thought about this.
Definitely.
Because I want it to be a comfortable group for everyone.
Definitely, and I think it sometimes depends too on the ages of all of this, right? I teach, and I kind of remind myself, I teach graduate students who usually have full-time jobs or sometimes have more experience than me, and so my approach sometimes is different than if I was teaching an 18-year-old, right? And so this is something that keep all of that in mind. But this also goes back to this idea of, can you read all of the posts, right? Can you respond to them all? And I don't believe you should respond to them all. But the idea of at least skimming them all is you can catch those incorrect things. Usually if people start replying, then it's easy to catch it. But it's that little comment that goes by that you miss. You're like, I missed that opportunity. And sometimes that teachable moment's gone and you're just like, let it go. All right. Create smaller discussion groups, right? So this goes back to class size, but if you've taught, at my old institution, we'd have psychology classes with 100 plus students online. We'd have business had 70. My program, we always had 20 or 30. And even 30 gets a little, so for me personally, when my class gets over 15, I often think about, at times, weaving in and out small group discussions, right? So it's not the same big class discussion thing, right? And sometimes those small groups will stay the same. Sometimes they will change. And it depends on my instructional goals. And it depends on a lot of things. But I think this idea of small groups can be very helpful. right? I mean, it's hard for students in large classes to raise their hand. When you're in a small group, it's a lot more, it's just more comfortable to kind of share what you're thinking.
Can I ask a quick
Definitely.
question on that? So in Blackboard, you set up the small groups as separate threads or separate discussions for each group?
Great question. The first honest response is I don't teach in Blackboard. I teach in Moodle. But I think there's two things I would say with that. It depends. So what I've done often, it's a thorny question from my perspective because I try to often set up my courses in modules or weeks. And so therefore I would have a discussion for that week that goes with it. And then if I wanted groups within it, I would set up 2 groups in there. And I tend to have my groups be open so other people can see. But there is sometimes a reason to make them closed. If you're going to have a debate, and so week 1, you're going to investigate this, you're pro, you're con, they're hidden groups, and then you're going to come back and share. But you don't want to be able to see what the enemy's planning, right? So there's times where I think closed groups really make sense. But I tend to have more of a philosophy. I love the idea that I can walk around as an instructor and I can see, or sometimes when you're in a bad group, it stinks. And when you can look over and see what the good group's doing, that's when you know, oh gosh, we got to do more here. So.
And I think it also relates to some of what you're teaching.
Definitely.
In addition to your goals, one of the classes I teach involves content that sometimes students choose to reveal more personal information than would be nice for the whole class not to know.
It's perfect, yeah.
Or if you think that there are problems with students hanging back, reading each other's work, and then using it to do their own work.
Yep.
I think there are definite reasons to do, just like you said.
Agree completely.
Have the private ones.
Private ones. And one of the things I'll talk about later is I'll often have students post their work in discussions. And so that sometimes, and I've worked with different faculty there, the math faculty, this or that. They're like, well, once one sees the problem, and there are ways where you can use small private groups to totally get around that, right? And they create these little, but I think the point here more than anything is the takeaway. It depends, but smaller groups can be very successful. Clear directions, expectations, and purpose, right? Why are you doing it? What do you expect, right? And we don't do this enough actually, I think, in face-to-face, right? We often have a double standard where we expect more from online. But in online, we don't know what to do, right? And students get there, and then like in my class where I'm doing it different than the last 3 courses, and even though I do have guidelines and I tell them why I'm doing it, they seem to forget because their prior knowledge suggests something different. Just like students' prior knowledge a lot of times in face-to-face is that they don't interact. They sit back, you tell them what they need, and they write it down, and they regurgitate. I mean, right, we learn these ways. But I think it's very important to tell them what you expect of them and why you expect it. All right, so open prompt that engages dialogue. This kind of came with the other, but it's this higher thinking. It's aligned to course objectives, and it's relevant, right, to their lives. And this is something that another study I want to do is I want to take and look at great course discussion prompts. I would love to take like Quality Matters and 500 people and have them send me the best discussion prompt they've ever written. Because I think it's really hard. It's like writing a good test question. It's really hard, but we all have a couple that we're like, that's a great question. It gets a great response. And I'd love to mine that for some things because I think there's a lot of truth to this, right? Is how do you write something that really gets a higher level, it aligns with your objectives and it's relevant to life? It's easier at times than others, but that's hard. All right, so now let's jump out of here. Back here. So I will share that with you guys. Thank you. All right, so now research. So what I did was I basically looked at, I don't even remember the details now, but it was something like the top 100 top cited journals on online discussions. And so I want to know, what do the journals that are being cited a lot say about online learning or online discussions specifically? And these are some things that came from it. And so number 1, and we already see, right, this almost is an argument, we don't need the research, we just need to get together and talk. But I think something more of that is that it's because we do things all the time and we don't share it in the literature. And this is my little ploy, I encourage all of you to write what you do and share it with the larger world, because so often what you do, it was years ago when I was at Regis, I'd go to a conference, someone's talking about this great new thing, I'm like, I've been doing that for years. And that was my big aha that, well, I better start presenting and sharing, because if you don't do that, people don't know the great things you're doing. And I could talk about the great things Christian is doing all day long, right? And it's because he's been sharing what he's done. And I think he needs to share with a larger audience. That's another topic for another day. Offer students choice, right? So we talked about that. Prior experience matters, right? It's like you guys read this already. Class size influences what works, right? If you have a class of 100 students, it doesn't mean you can't have discussions. It just means they have to be done differently, right? Maybe you have 10 groups of 10, and then they have to come up and present, each one of them, what they discussed, right? And you're not necessarily monitoring every 100 students talking 18 times, right? Require students to take part, right? Lesson is, if you don't grade it, they're not going to do that. Now, there's some exceptions, and I've had students where, they're adult learners, and we talk about how they're just always engaged, baloney, right? I've done it where I haven't graded discussions, and only about 10% of them often will take part. Now, in some ways, you'd argue, well, that's fine. Those who need it take part, right? But I found that if I want more, and if I want to push those on the edge, and I do believe in the value of lurking, but for a lot of students, you need to grade it, or they're not going to take part. Mixing synchronous sessions. So we get so caught up with this idea of what online learning is it's asynchronous, right? We promote our programs that you can do it in your jammies. It won't get in the way of your life and your job and all these 18 more things you have. Where the reality is sometimes, especially my work, graduate school, does get in the way of life. It is inconvenient. And sometimes synchronous is the best way to do it. But if you're going to do it, you need to always be upfront and clear with students so they know the expectations. To be honest, I've never required synchronous sessions. I've always done it as optional when I've done it. And so the course I'm doing right now, I actually took the naming. It's all Christian. I've given them. I call it Happy Hours. This was Christian's beautiful. There's a little copyright on it. But it's basically I've done virtual office hours and people never show up. Start calling them Happy Hours and people start showing up. It's still only about 15%, right? And I only do 4 of them. But those 4, and it's basically, guys, we're here to, talk about the course, do whatever, but some of them who need it show up. And I pushed against doing this for a long time because not many showed up, it's not worth my time. And I've kind of had a new thinking on this is, for those who need it, they need it. And it doesn't take that much for me to provide it. I don't do it every week. I used to do it every week, then I went to every weekend, then I went to only doing it once at midterm, and now my happy medium, we'll see if I continue, is 4 times. Set expectations, clear guidelines, right? And all this we've talked about. Strategies and discussion questions matter. Provide timely multiple types of feedback. So this is partly grading, but it's not just grading. So I'll give you my experience right now, even as the course I'm teaching, it was designed originally by someone else, and the way the discussions were set up were different than I had ever done. And I was like, oh, I kind of like this idea. Let's just see how this goes. And the basic idea is the top 10 discussions are graded. And so at the end of the semester. And so they basically will tell me these are my top 10. These are my best posts based on this rubric, and you'll grade it. Because one of the things that I hate is I hate grading discussions. I hate it. I don't mind engaging in it, but it's that kind of bean counting that kind of can drive me mad at times, right? And so I really liked this idea of doing it at the end of the semester. But something that they push back, and this 3rd time I've taught the course, is that I have clear guidelines in my syllabus. I do a scavenger hunt up front where they have to regurgitate what I expect. And they still find I'm halfway through the semester, and I had this whole discussion thread last week about what's the discussion, how am I grading it, what am I counting, right? And it's because they're not getting that timely feedback. And so I still think I could do this thing where your best 5 the first half of the semester, but they need that feedback to know I'm on track. I'm doing it the way you want, right? And ultimately, I don't want them to worry about the grade, right? I can sit there and the grades don't matter, but they do to them, right? They do. So timely, I think, is really important there. Structure plays a key role, right? The literature shows keeping that discussion going, but also not overtaking it. This keeps you isolated. And even with discussion, right? Because they don't necessarily know how to do this. So this is what the literature says, top themes. I'm going to go over a couple of my top tips.
Can I just ask a question?
Of course you may.
Timely feedback. Have you ever, what's your about peer responses?
It's it's one of my tips. So the question is, peer grading, and I think it can be done well. Once again, it depends on how it's set up, right? And so peer grading even, well, what do you mean? So sometimes it could be you have a group project and they have a small group they have to work on, right? And you can have them peer assess how their members took part in a discussion, all of that. And then that works with your own grade, and then they have a self-assessment, let's say, right? And there's 3 parts to that overall project grade. That can work really effective. The other thing that I've done is this thing called karma points or inspiration points. The idea is kind of like Reddit or these places where you can upvote, right? And actually, Coursera, some of the MOOCs have really good software for doing this. But it's the popular, if I like your thing, I like it, right? And the more likes moves up. And so the idea is you give each student a certain amount of points that they can reward to their peers. But they have to justify, because you want to get away from the click, oh, this is my buddy, I'm just going to ding, 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 right? But I think it could be very successful. Yes?
So have you ever taught face-to-face?
Yes.
This program? Okay.
For this program?
Yeah. Is it all online?
Oh, EdTech, all online. I've taught face-to-face before, yes, at 2 institutions.
So
Yeah.
let me give you a scenario, right?
Definitely.
So let's say I'm in your face-to-face class, right? Or let's say I'm in online class and that's not face, but then you offer the face-to-face class. I suddenly see that you're this awesome rockstar teacher who engages me in it. How do you mimic that in the online classes? Because it's a bit different, right? How do you take it from this energy that you have in your online class?
It's so my dissertation, you'll read that there's the first part where I'm going into it. When I started teaching online, I was afraid that like what I do face to face would not translate, right? I get energetic, I get all this, my presence, my immediacy. How do I do that, right? That's what my research focuses on, this idea of social presence. That you establish yourself as a real person. How do I do this, right? And there's lots of ways, and it's well beyond our 10 minutes here. But it is. There are a lot of strategies, from using online video to using synchronous sessions to humor. I mean, the research shows lots of ways to use what I perceive you're talking about as instructor presence, right? How do I help them feel who I am, right? And so one of the research study I'm doing right now is actually surveying my students to find out what they think of my use of online video, because I want to get at that, because there's this tension between, well, gosh, if I have to use closed caption, transcribe everything I do versus, right, and that we got to find this happy medium of where do you let yourself shine? But I believe that if you're a rock star, you could be a rock star online. And so, but we could talk more about that later. But I definitely believe for any of you that I would love to.
How to be an online rock star.
Definitely. It's a great, it's a title for an article.
Yeah.
So one of my favorite article titles I wrote was "Hot for Teacher: Using Digital Music in the Online Classroom." And then when they published it, so Hot for Teacher is a Van Halen song, they made the Hot for Teacher so small that you couldn't even see it. I was so disappointed in the journal. And we presented at a conference once, and they asked us to rename it. They said they would not let us use Hot for Teacher as our, but no, they just thought it was too racy. It doesn't. All right. So some of my tips, social presence is what I like to research, and this idea of how do I establish myself as a real person? How do I help students get a sense that it's more than a pixel on the screen, that they get to know each other, right? And so a couple of tips from my years of research are one-on-one communication matters. So you can set up these big classes, but often they need to hear from you, one-on-one, right? Low-tech strategies can help. Pick up the phone. Right? There's this idea that somehow, no, it needs to, especially my courses, they're technology. Why would I use the phone? Right? Use the phone or use an email one-on-one. Right? We hear all this, oh, email's dead, baloney. Right? A one-on-one email about your concern for a student is, at least in my experience, is important. Past future relationships matter. And that goes back to people who've had successful experiences in group projects with people. Those build throughout time in the program. The same way, though, a bad experience can go the other way. It's kind of like looping, but group projects can help. We often like to avoid group projects, but group projects could be a great way online. But once again, it's how you set up, how you structure, how you assess it. Small groups. We've already gotten into that. Another thing, and I'm going to give you a handout on protocols. These are a couple. And essentially, that you post by Wednesday, reply to 2 people by, that's in ways a discussion protocol. You're telling them how to do this. Well, there's lots of ways you can set up discussions. I'm going to give you a handout, but think about variety. Because the same old thing, 1 discussion, 2 replies, every week can get dull, right? So running out of time. I'm going to get past this. Death to the Dropbox. It's an article I wrote for EduCause. It's this idea of let's stop having students just upload their work privately. Blackboard used to call their assignment tool the Dropbox, right? And so for me, I try to a lot of times have students post their work online. Now, part of it depends. It's on your area. I've gotten debates on and on with faculty. It won't work in my area. I would argue it can work in a lot of areas. But yes, there might be the one or two it won't work in. But the idea is how do you get them to share their work? And then sometimes I will even give them feedback. I won't grade it. I'll give them feedback publicly in this discussion so they can see the feedback I give on the work, right? And so that article is online. I would encourage you to read it and think about that. And finally, with assessing discussions, there's a lot of things we can think about, right? There's the ungraded versus graded, and they don't all have to be graded. I have optional discussions always in my class. Whether it's, I have a cyber cafe, which everyone does, but I post things in there like the Oscars. I post things about the Super Bowl. Anything going on in the world, I want to get them in there. I also post silly things, right? I post a funny caption picture, and they have to caption it, right? I do lots of different things, so it doesn't all have to be graded or ungraded. We get in this issue of quantity versus quality, right? Is it just that they're just hitting the numbers? And sometimes that might be it, right? There are times where there might be a reason for that. Checklist versus rubric versus maybe complete or not complete, right? Should actually be a third one there. A lot of times I see these really complicated rubrics for discussions, and they can help, right? Get at that quality. But I'm also trying to balance my teacher workload here. And I only have so much bandwidth. And when I look at most rubrics for online discussions, they make my head spin because they're just too much. It's not practical. Or sometimes I can get at a checklist that says, you get 1 point if you post. You get 2 points if you post 3 times. You get 3 points if you cite the literature 4 points if it's quality. And then I can just sit there. There's not scales with different for each of the criteria, right? So there's lots of ways you can do this. Individual versus group, right? You can assess them or assess the group. Say your group came back and shared. So like when you guys did your little group work, you guys were outstanding, right? So you can assess the group as a whole. You can also student versus teacher, right? Have the students self-assess. Whether that's like mine where I have them pick their 10 best. I'm involved with the Equip program in the ETOS course. It's the first time I'd ever seen it. They actually have online quizzes where they have to self-assess how they did, right? So it's trying to offload sounds bad, but trying to help put the ownership back in them because they can start reflecting on, even if you graded it at the end and didn't really use the self-assessments, it helps them sit there and think weekly, did I do that? Oh gosh, I didn't this week. Maybe I need to next. Karma points. So, and the faculty who did this later renamed it inspiration points because someone was offended by the word karma. But the idea is those who inspire you, you upvote them, you give them points, right? And you try to encourage. So what I've done is almost a different thing this semester is I've given extra credit for students who, it's a course on web development and people have problems all the time. And so people who have experience in it, it's hard because they find they're bored because they already know some of this stuff. And so they can get points, extra points for helping people and giving specific feedback, right? Take a screencast and say, this is where you did it wrong. So when people post things online, the peers can, and just changing that. Before I told them that was always ideal. Now I gave points to it. I have like 5 in these 2 sections, 5 people who they're beating me every problem that comes up. And they're giving outstanding feedback. So that's kind of this idea of letting and then not only they're getting outstanding feedback, then their peers are coming back and saying how grateful they are for student X, right? And so they're getting that positive love. All right. So I'm going to pass out these. Running out of time, and these are, when I was at the University of Colorado Denver, I edited a book, two volumes, I guess, 2 years. This is the back of one of them. This is Joni Dunlop's work. She was my dissertation advisor, colleague. I write a lot with her. So there's basically 3 things here. The first thing is kind of down and dirty guidelines for discussions, right? And so Joni's approaching this as what are the basics that people need, right? And these are online too. So if the idea of carrying paper scares you, the URL there under the titles will tell you how to find it. The second thing I believe is the protocols, and it goes into different protocols. And then the third thing is it goes into group work. And these three little pages, for some of you, it might not, you're pros, right? You already told me everything that the literature tells us. But maybe you have a colleague who could use this. So I encourage you to look at that, because I think there are certain things, you can look into a number of these things where it talks about setting the tone for social caring, giving learners a role. That's the other thing that we didn't even get into. Sometimes we'll have students lead and facilitate the discussions, right? So you set up little groups and you rotate in who facilitates the discussion and the reading, right? So there's lots of different ways that you can do this. I encourage you to spend some time. This comes from, I've lost it, the online handbooks. But another thing I want to encourage you, and it's more than just discussions. I love these two books, and I have written some stuff in it. But that's not to promote my work, but more to say there's some great stuff in here, and they're usually like 1 to 2 page, 3 page ideas, almost like blog posts of people have ideas of how they do X. So they're not all just discussions, but I find that we revert to discussions because we don't know how not to do it. It's what we know, right? We lecture in class and we discuss and we test. That's what we do. So when we get online, what do? We lecture, we record it maybe, or worse, we upload a PowerPoint and that's it, right? We discuss and we assess, right? And assess usually means test, right? And that's unfortunately what so many courses, online courses look like, and face-to-face. But there are great face-to-face courses and the great online courses. But usually the great ones, they go away from just one discussion a week, 2 replies, right? And so think about other ways that you could be creative that you can, because if it's a bad assessment, maybe there's a better way to assess learning than that discussion, right? If it's about community building, maybe there's a better way to get at community building, whether it's with social media or all kinds of other things. So with that, I really ran out of time. I need and I've done this before, so I should know better. But any questions as we wrap up?
A question on this team online learning form here.
Yes.
Evaluation. Is that on Blackboard or you use Qualtrics?
That is, when she did that, actually, she did it with a web form back in the day. I would probably I love Qualtrics, but prior to Qualtrics, Google Forms was my favorite thing in the world. And so my current courses, I haven't used that form, but I would probably if I was in Blackboard, I'd probably just set up in Blackboard because everything was in Blackboard, right? But for a long time, Google Forms was the easiest way to get especially anonymous feedback. So Blackboard, you can use the survey tool if you want them to add their names. It just depends on how you do it. But the more you could keep it, certain things in LMS, sometimes the better. There's always FERPA and there's other things to consider. Other questions? Okay, I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you for coming. Grab a cookie or a piece of pizza on your way out. There's a lot of food and I don't know what I'm going to do. And thank you for coming.
Sure.
So they can upload.
Yeah. I don't think there's a way to currently limit that.
Like when you create
So the way that we've done it,
So this is different.
the inspiration one, she basically replied and said, you get one smart point because, and I explain why. And they only get, let's say, 1 point a week for a B, right? So they have to choose who. And you could even set up rules that say you can't give the same person the point more than 3 points. But it's a very transparent thing, right? But it can get cumbersome because if you already have a big discussion, there's extra threads. But what I want something like Amazon that would let me put my stars, leave a comment I want to, and then it's like, no, you've already done this. I want something that's sophisticated. It's not there yet.
Like you'll see one or two decades.
We'll definitely try and get
They'll just see theirs, and then they can use
Well, definitely, right? They don't want to be critical. So it could be that,
we talk about that.
yeah.
Or if you want to
doesn't.
all of it.
Yeah, right. And that's part of the thing is,
discussion post.
some students don't take it seriously, right? And they don't care and they just get their points. But usually what happens, and some students just take it easy. Oh, everyone likes that one, I'll just do that one. Right? So time saving way of not reading all the posts. But often what, in like Reddit is the things that at least are provocative kind of eventually make their way up. And that happens, so sometimes then you circle back. Definitely. Thank you.